Thomas Stepenwaski stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, watching a bead of sweat trace down his temple. His knuckles had gone white against the steering wheel, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered the leather cover creaking under his grip. 3 cars ahead, the traffic light remained stubbornly red. "Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, he whispered, his therapist's voice echoing in his head. But another voice was there too. Deeper, accented, familiar, his father's voice. "Just like me, Sin, just like me." The light turned green. The minivan ahead didn't move. Thomas felt it then, that familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the tightening in his jaw that promised violence. The car's interior seemed to drop 10 degrees, though the August heat blazed outside. He watched his reflection fade slightly in the mirror, then sharpen again. A trick of the light, surely. 3 seconds passed. The minivan didn't move. His hand found the horn before he could stop himself. The long blast shattered the morning quiet, and when the minivan still didn't move, something snapped. Thomas yanked his door open, the summer heat hitting him like a physical blow. He was halfway to the minivan when its driver finally noticed the green light and pulled away. Standing in the middle of the road, Thomas watched his chance for confrontation escape, his hands shaking, bile rising in his throat. A chorus of horns erupted behind him. "I am not him," Thomas muttered later, turning into the parking garage of Midwest Financial where he worked as an account manager. "I am not him." The words felt hollow, just as they had 20 years ago when he'd found his grandmother's diary hidden in their Milwaukee basement. The pages were written in Polish, a language he'd never learned, but somehow he'd understood the warning scrawled in the margins. "The rage passes down, father to son, a curse in our blood." Back then, he'd dismissed it as an old woman's superstition. Now, at 43, with a failing marriage and mandatory anger management sessions every Thursday, he wasn't so sure. Last week's session still burned in his memory. He'd thrown a chair through the window when Dr. Patterson suggested his anger stemmed from childhood trauma. The police had been called. Only his wife Kelly's tearful pleading had kept him out of jail. Thomas parked in his usual spot, C-47, away from other cars, away from people he might have to interact with. He grabbed his briefcase, straightened his tie, and began his daily ritual of becoming normal Thomas. Professional Thomas. Thomas who doesn't break things when he's angry. The elevator was mercifully empty. As it rose to the 14th floor, Thomas practiced his breathing exercises again. The overhead light flickered once, twice. He ignored it, just as he ignored the way his reflection in the polished doors seemed slightly out of sync with his movements. "Morning, Mr. S," chirped Amy from reception. She was new, 3 weeks in, still cheerful. She hadn't learned to avoid eye contact yet, like the others. She hadn't been there for the Christmas party incident when he'd put his fist through the wall after losing the office gift exchange game. "Good morning," he managed, heading straight for his office. Inside, he immediately closed the blinds. The darkness helped. So did the isolation. Here, he could focus on spreadsheets and client portfolios, letting numbers fill his mind instead of the constant thrumming anger that lived in his bones. His phone buzzed. Kelly. His wife's contact photo showed her smiling, happy, a photo from 5 years ago, before she'd started sleeping in the guest room, before he'd destroyed their kitchen during an argument about dinner plans, before she'd started flinching at sudden movements. Need to talk. Important. Dinner tonight? Thomas stared at the message until the screen went dark, catching a warped reflection of his face in the black glass. He knew that tone. It was the same tone she'd used when she suggested separate bedrooms, when she recommended anger management, when she stopped wearing her wedding ring after he'd flipped their dining room table during Sunday brunch with her parents. The pressure behind his eyes returned. His computer screen flickered, though his office lights remained steady. In the darkness of his office, he could almost see something moving in his peripheral vision, almost hear his father's laugh. "You're just like me, Sin. The hunger grows stronger with each generation." The message from Kelly still waited for a response. Thomas placed his phone face down on his desk, next to the family photo he kept as a reminder. In it, his father stood stern and straight, one heavy hand on young Thomas's shoulder. The glass of the frame was cracked in one corner from when he'd thrown it last month during a phone call with his sister about their father's declining health. A knock at his door made him jump. "Mr. Stepenwaski?" It was Derek from accounting. "About the Johnston portfolio." "Not now," Thomas growled, hearing the edge in his voice, the one that sounded too much like his father. "It's just that there are some discrepancies that need immediate—" "I said not now!" The overhead light burst with a pop, showering glass onto his desk. In the sudden dimness, Thomas saw Derek's face go pale. The door closed quickly, feet hurrying away down the hall. It reminded him of how his childhood friends used to run when his father came home, how neighbors would hustle their children inside when the Stepenwaski temper flared. Thomas sat in the semi-darkness, listening to his heartbeat thunder in his ears. On his desk, the family photo had fallen face down. When he picked it up, he noticed something strange. In the reflection of the cracked glass, his father's figure seemed to be smiling. The day deteriorated from there. By lunch, rumors of his outburst had spread. Co-workers took longer routes to avoid passing his office. In the break room, conversations died when he entered. The coffee machine shorted out when he tried to use it, sending sparks into the air. He'd nearly lost control again when someone had muttered "crazy Stepenwaski" under their breath, but the memory of Kelly's tears after his last outburst held him back. At 3:47 p.m., his sister called. "Dad's dead," she said without preamble. "They found him in his apartment in Warsaw. Heart attack, they think. The neighbors reported shouting, things breaking, just like that night with Mom, remember?" Thomas barely heard the rest. The phone grew ice cold in his hand. In his chest, something shifted, like a lock turning, like a door opening. He remembered that night, his father's rage, his mother's screams, the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. That evening, he never made it to dinner with Kelly. Instead, he sat in his car outside their house for hours, watching the lights go out one by one. The temperature dropped steadily, though his weather app showed 75 degrees. In the rearview mirror, his reflection grew darker, more solid, more like his father's with each passing minute. When he finally went inside, Kelly was waiting in the kitchen. Papers were spread across the table, legal documents, he realized. Divorce papers. "I can't do this anymore, Thomas," she said softly. "The anger, the incidents, the things that happen when you're upset. I'm afraid of you, just like your mother was afraid of your father." Something snapped. The kitchen lights exploded all at once. In the sudden darkness, Thomas felt the rage rise like a living thing, felt it fill his chest and throat and eyes. The temperature plummeted. Somewhere distantly he heard Kelly scream. When awareness returned, the kitchen was in ruins. Kelly was gone. Cabinets hung from broken hinges, their contents scattered across the floor. The granite countertop had somehow cracked down the middle, though he had no memory of striking it. On the floor, scattered among broken glass and torn papers, lay his father's old prayer beads, the ones he'd left in Warsaw years ago, the ones that couldn't possibly be here. In the weeks that followed, Thomas lost everything. Kelly filed for divorce and a restraining order, citing 16 separate incidents of destructive rage. The firm placed him on indefinite leave after the incident with Derek. His sister stopped taking his calls after he mentioned hearing their father's voice in empty rooms. The house grew colder, darker. Electronics failed regularly. Sometimes, late at night, he caught himself speaking Polish in his father's voice. The mirrors showed strange shadows, and his reflection wasn't always where it should be. On the last night, as his heart raced with familiar pressure and unexplainable cold filled the room, Thomas found himself holding his grandmother's diary. The Polish words suddenly made perfect sense. The rage isn't just anger, it's hunger, it's inheritance, it's waiting. His heart seized. The diary fell from nerveless fingers. As darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, Thomas saw his reflection in the window. It smiled his father's smile. They found him the next morning, clutching his father's prayer beads, his face frozen in a snarl that would have looked familiar to anyone who knew the Stepenwaski men. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, just like his father. But in the darkness of the empty house, a shadow still moves. And sometimes, on quiet nights, passers-by hear muffled voices arguing in Polish, though the house remains empty.